Happiness, therefore, in exact proportion with the morality of rational beings, whereby they are made worthy of happiness, constitutes alone the highest good of a world into which we absolutely must transport ourselves according to the commands of pure but practical reason. This world is, it is true, only an intelligible world, for of such a systematic unity of purposes as it requires, the world of sense gives us no hint. Its reality can be based on nothing else but the hypothesis of a supreme original good. In it, independent reason, equipped with all the sufficiency of a supreme cause, founds, maintains, and fulfills the universal order of things with the most perfect purposiveness, however much this order may be hidden from us in the world of sense. Immanuel Kant. For over a year now, I discussed Kant's practical philosophy. And I have now gone through all parts of this practical philosophy. I've discussed Kant's ethics, I have discussed Kant's philosophy of right, and I have discussed what Kant has to say about happiness and about the good life. There's one last topic I want to go into to close off what I have to say about Kant's practical philosophy. And that is the topic of the highest good. Because, after all, practical philosophy is about our actions. It's about what we do, right? That's what praxis means. And you could say that in all that we do, in all our actions, we try to realize what is good. We try to do something good, at least what we think is good. But of course, there are different kinds of good, right? There is the ethical good, that which is good in itself, that which is the right thing to do. There is the juridical good, which is justice, right? There's also the pragmatic good, that which is good for me, which is to my advantage, which brings me happiness. And since there are different kinds of good, the question arises, which is most important, or in other words, what is the highest good? Or in Latin, the summum bonum, which is an old expression in philosophy, which is not a term that Kant himself came up with. What is new, what is original is not a question for the highest good, but is how Kant answers this question and also how he deals with the highest good. Because the thing is that, of course, when you act morally, you will try to realize what is good. You will try to act towards the good. And the highest goal of morality, whatever it is, must therefore be the highest good. This should be self-evident. But Kant would say the big mistake of moral philosophy so far was to first ask what is the highest good, and then once this is found, to say, okay, since this is the highest good, this is what we should do, right? There can be discussions about what is the highest good. Is it the perfection of humanity? Is it the greatest happiness for the greatest number? Whatever. But as soon as the highest good is found, you then say, okay, and it is our moral obligation to realize this highest good. This, however, leads to heteronomy. So you are not truly free, you are not under your own moral law, you are under a law that you get from the outside. I discussed this further in my lecture on the principles of morality. Like you will say, okay, this is the highest good, not I have made it so. It is the highest good independently of me. Let's say God determined that it is the highest good, or let's say because it feels good to everyone, it is the highest good. And then you're supposed to act accordingly. Then you're supposed to realize the highest good, which of course always leads to the question, okay, why should I? Right? Why should I be moral? Even if I accept that this is the highest good, why should I care? The great achievement of Kant in moral philosophy is to have done away with the heteronomy, with claiming there is some moral obligation independently from you that you have to submit to, where you could always ask why. And as soon as you ask why, you already stepped outside of morality, because then you're asking what is in it for me? How does it bring an advantage for me to follow the moral law? And maybe we can claim that it brings an advantage. Maybe someone can say, okay, God wants you to do this and that, and if you do, then you will be rewarded with heaven, and if not, you will be punished with hell. But in that case, if that's what moves you, you are no longer moral. You are just being pragmatic. You're just doing what you think will get you a reward, or will prevent punishment for you, but you're not doing what is right because it's right. No, the great achievement of Kant is to have grounded morality in autonomy, so self-law-giving. He has shown that it is our own reason which gives itself, which gives us a law. If we reflect, if we think about what we should do, we ourselves come to the conclusion that this and that is the right thing to do. So there is no longer the question even, why should I do it? Why should I act morally? Well, I should. I simply have the insight. I tell myself, I myself come to the conclusion that I should do this. So for Kant, the highest good is not at the beginning of morality. We shouldn't first ask what is the highest good, and then, because it is the highest good, we are obliged to do it. But rather, it is at the end of morality. We first should ask, what should we do? And then, whatever action we are supposed to do will, of course, if it is successful, have a result. And that result will be the highest good, because it is the necessary result of the action we ought to do. It must be a good result. Maybe to make this more clear, because this might be quite abstract, let's go with examples. Let's say someone is drowning. Now, other theories of morality would say it is good that he survives, for whatever reason, because God wants it, because his life has an innate worth, because it would create greater happiness rather than suffering, whatever. But for some reason, it is good that he survives. Therefore, you should do the action that will lead to this good, to his survival. Therefore, you should pull him out. So here, it is not the action as such that matters. It is the result that matters, right? The action is just a means to an end. Kant, on the other hand, shows that when someone is drowning, what our own reason tells us is you are supposed to help this person. You have a duty to help this person who is drowning. Now, if I ask myself, okay, what would happen if I do this, if I help? Then, of course, the answer is this person's life would be saved. And therefore, it is good that this person's life is saved. But you understand, this is not what comes first. It's not that it's good for this person to stay alive, therefore I should help him. Rather, I should help this person, therefore it is good that he survives. This is important because, as I explained in the lecture on the goodwill, Kant says having a good will is all that matters in morality. The good will being the will that wants to follow the moral law simply because it is the moral law, simply because it is the right thing to do. If we were to start with saying it is good that this person survives, I want this person to stay alive, therefore I'm saving him, then the question would be, okay, why? Why do I think it's good that this person survives? And maybe because this person is my friend, maybe I know him. So this would be not a moral reason, right? This would be ultimately a selfish reason. I would save him because I myself would be sad if he was dead. If we go with Kant instead, we are not saying it would be good for this person to survive, maybe because we like him, but rather we say it is good to help this person. It is our moral obligation to help this person. So only here do we have the goodwill. Only here do we do something not because there's something in it for us, but because it is the right thing to do. This means that with Kant's morality, there's not the danger that the end ever justifies the means. So there's no possibility that you would ever do something evil with the excuse that it will achieve something good or that it will prevent some greater evil or whatever. No. With Kant's morality, the ends is not the ends. And your action that leads to this end is not a mere means that is not relevant but for the result. No. It is the action itself that is relevant. The action is not just a means. The action itself is supposed to be a good action. Doing the right thing, not to achieve some result, but because it is the right thing. At the same time, this moral philosophy also means that if you're not successful, you don't have to beat yourself up. For your morality, it doesn't matter, right? If you jump into the lake and swim over to pull the drowning person out, but you're not there in time and the person drowns, of course that's sad. Of course that's bad for that person and whoever knew him. But for your own inner morality, it doesn't matter. Because what matters for you being a moral person is that you had the goodwill, that you wanted to do the right thing. You are not less of a good person for not being successful in doing the right thing, right? Think as another example of Greta Thunberg, who at several times, when asked why she's doing her climate activism, or whether she has hope that it will even be successful, that we will save the climate, at several times she has said she can of course not know the future and we might not be successful, but at least she will be able to look in the mirror. She will be able to look at herself when she's old and say that she at least has done what she could do, that at least it's not her fault. So this is the point. If she were to say, okay, I want to save the climate, then this would not be moral. You would ask, okay, why? Why do you want to save the climate? What's your reason? And the reason would not be the goodwill, but maybe some selfish reason. Maybe she would want to save the climate because she is young, so she herself will suffer from the climate collapse. And also, if she just were to say, I want to save the climate, so if she were to focus on the end, then she could say, okay, whatever means lead to saving the climate is okay, right? You could save the climate by killing 90% of humanity, right? That would probably save the climate. But of course, it would be a very evil act, which of course she would never do, even if she had the chance to. No, she goes about the other way, the Kantian way. She simply has the goodwill that wants to do the right thing because it's right. And in this case, the right thing is fighting for climate justice. And only because fighting for climate justice, if it is successful, will lead to the climate being saved, only because of that can you say the climate being saved is a good thing. Because again, it's a necessary result of the action that the goodwill is supposed to take. But it's not that it first is a good thing, and because of that we take that action, right? This solves one of the main problems of moral philosophy, right? You don't go about first arbitrarily defining something as good, and then again arbitrarily telling people, okay, now you have to act towards it. But rather you first ask, okay, what should you do? What action should you undertake? And then it follows necessary that whatever these actions lead into must be considered good, because these actions are the actions that we ought to take. So, in other words, Kant says the highest good that was always discussed in practical philosophy, the highest good does have a place in moral philosophy, but not at its start, but rather at its end. It's not supposed to be the determinant of the moral action, meaning we're not supposed to act because this action will hopefully cause the highest good. Rather, we're supposed to act because simply this action in itself is good. This action is what we are supposed to do. But while not being the determinant of morality, the highest good can still be the matter, the content of morality. In other words, that which is realized through the moral action. But now, with these general remarks out of the way, let's get into the question of what actually is the highest good. In other words, what is it that would be realized through morality if we all acted morally? What goal would we act towards? Well, you could just ask people. And if you grabbed random people on the street and asked them, what is the highest good for you? What is most important? Or what would you want most? Or what do you try to act towards with all your actions? Or if you had one wish, what would you want to realize? Then many people would probably say it's their happiness. This is the most general way we could express it. Of course, they would probably say very different things, because they would probably believe that different things make them happy, right? Like one person maybe wants a family and a house with a garden. The other person maybe wants to be very rich. A third person maybe wants to travel the world, whatever. But if you ask them, okay, and why do you want this? Then they would probably say, because I believe it would make me happy. So the actual content of happiness might be very different, But most people would agree that the most important thing, that the highest good for them in life, is being happy. Now, a note on how Kant defines happiness. He would say that happiness is the maximum of welfare. Welfare to him means the pleasure you take in your state, right? So the state you're in, if that is a pleasurable state for whatever reason, then you have welfare. But welfare is not necessarily permanent. Maybe you're eating a good dinner right now, or maybe you are with your friends and having fun, then you are in a state of welfare. But the next day, maybe you get sick and you hurt and you don't have welfare. So, welfare is what we would also call happiness in the everyday language, but to Kant, happiness is only true happiness if it is lasting, if it encompasses your whole life. If we are only focusing on a moment, on a momentary state, then Kant is speaking of welfare. So happiness to him is defined as the maximum of welfare, and this is what most people want. If you know anything about Kant's philosophy, and if you followed these lectures so far, this phrasing should make you alert. Happiness is the maximum of welfare. Happiness is obviously a concept that I'm thinking, right? And when it comes to concepts, there's the concepts of the intellect to Kant. I gave a lecture about what is the intellect, and the intellect is the faculty of concepts to him. So concepts are sorts of a rule according to which we understand the world. So the intellect may think concepts like the concept of what is a house, what is a dog, what is water, also what is causality, or what is reality, or whatever. But as I explained in my lecture on what is reason, reason to Kant has its own concepts, and they are concepts of something absolute, of a maximum, like God or freedom, or the concept of wisdom or of justice or of goodness. These concepts, again, I explained this in the lecture on what is reason, these concepts Kant calls ideas, because they are not concepts of something limited, they are concepts that express a maximum that cannot be increased in degree anymore. And for that very reason, Kant says they cannot be found in experience, right? The concepts of the intellect you can find in experience. You can experience a house or a dog, you can experience causality, even if they are concepts of something that doesn't actually exist, like the concept of a unicorn. If it existed, then you could experience it. But when it comes, on the other hand, to the ideas, these concepts of reason, we cannot experience something that is not limited, something that is absolute. So we cannot experience God, or we cannot experience justice. We can maybe experience a single act that is just, but justice or goodness or wisdom, full unlimited wisdom, this is something we could not possibly experience. Even if we were to live in the perfect state with completely just laws and institutions, we could only say from experience, okay, so far we have only experienced just actions, we have not experienced anything unjust. But that would leave open the possibility that in the future we might experience something unjust, right? So we can never experience the absolute. And this is true for the concept, or rather the idea, as it turns out, of happiness too, right? Of course, I can experience welfare, but happiness, the maximum of welfare, unlimited welfare, is not something I can possibly experience. For that very reason, in antiquity, the ancient Greeks, like for example Aristotle, used to say that you cannot call anyone that is alive happy. If anything, you have to wait till their death to call them happy, because while they are alive, you could only say, okay, so far they have always had welfare, but you don't know if this will last, right? Aristotle says, look at Priamos, the king of Troy, who for the most part had a good life, but then in his age he had to see his city destroyed, his children killed, and so on. So happiness is not a concept we know from experience. From experience, we only know welfare. We only know a state of pleasure, but not this constant, never-ending welfare. Rather, it is an idea. It is something we think. Now, it is different from the other ideas, Kant says, because usually the ideas come from our reason. Reason is the faculty of ideas to Kant. But this idea Kant calls an idea of the power of imagination. Why is that? Because how are our ideas, our concepts of something absolute, something maximal, how are they created? Well, we take a concept that we already have of something limited, and then our reason increases it to the maximum. But this concept that we start with, where does this come from? Well, our concepts can either be empirical concepts that we gain from experience, like the concept of a dog, for example, or they can be pure concepts, which Kant calls notions, which come out of our intellect itself, like the concept of causality, for example. Causality, this is a very important point in Kant's whole philosophy, is not something we learn about from experience. Rather, we have a concept of it in our intellect a priori, meaning before we make experience, and only because we have this concept can we make experience, applying this concept. I discussed this in previous lectures, like my lecture about empiricism and rationalism, and my lecture on what is experience. Now, the point is this. Usually, you have a concept, a pure concept from your intellect, like the concept of causality, and now your reason thinks the maximum of that. And the maximum of causality would be the idea of freedom, for example, right? Would be the idea of something, some action that starts a chain of causality, so that causes other things, but that is not itself caused by other things. That is the first spontaneous cause of other things. So your reason takes up the concept of something limited and thinks of it as something unlimited, but this concept that your reason operates with is a concept that does not come from experience. It is a pure concept, a concept of your intellect. Now, in the case of the idea of happiness, the concept that you are starting with, the concept of something limited, is the concept of welfare. And this is not a concept that comes from your intellect, that you have a priori, rather you have this a posteriori, meaning this is a concept that comes from experience. We know what welfare is, not because it is in our intellect and the nature of our intellect to know this, to think of this, but rather because we have experienced welfare. So someone who would never have experienced a single pleasure in life, who would always have been in pain and always suffered, would not be able to think of welfare. He first needs to experience it. In other words, Kant calls this, the idea of happiness, an idea of the power of imagination, because the operation of thinking is the same as in the case of all ideas. Taking a concept and then thinking of it as an unlimited maximum. But the content with which we undertake this operation, the content is an empirical concept, something we get from experience, while in the case of other ideas, like the idea of justice or the idea of goodness or whatever, this is not the case. And this is an important point, because it means that only a sensual being that is able to feel pleasure and pain, such as we, can have an idea of happiness. This means that if there was a being of pure reason, this being could still think of justice, of wisdom, of holiness, because you don't need any experience to arrive at these ideas. But such a being of pure reason, which was incapable of feeling pain or pleasure, could not gain an idea of happiness. Because since it doesn't know from experience what pleasure is, it can also not imagine constant, everlasting pleasure. So happiness is different from the other ideas, is an idea that only a sensual being such as we can have, but it is still an idea. And that's an important point of Kant's. It means, for example, as I have already said in previous lectures, like my lecture on the animal and the animal ethics, it means, for one, that animals don't have an idea of happiness. It's not that Kant says they don't feel pain and pleasure. They do know welfare, of course, because they can be in a state that feels good. But since they don't think, since they don't reflect, since they don't have a thinking faculty, they cannot take their experience of pleasure and imagine it as a maximum. Imagine unbroken, never-ending pleasure. So they are always in the moment. They can desire something pleasurable in the moment, but they cannot desire happiness and they cannot be unhappy. Again, I discussed this in my lecture on animal ethics, also in my lecture on the practical idealism, how this is an important difference between animals and humans. But the insight that happiness is an idea, that when we think of happiness, we think of something absolute, of a maximum, is also important as an argument against the empiricists in morality, right? The empiricists would say that morality cannot be deduced from pure reason, as Kant claims. Rather, what is or what isn't moral has to be based on our experience, on how we feel. An empiricist morality would always be some form of eudaimonism, eudaimonia meaning happiness, So some sort of morality that says you have to act towards happiness, right? For example, utilitarianism that says you should generate the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, or prevent the greatest unhappiness for the greatest number of people. And the empiricists may claim that their morality is empirical, that it is based just on experience, not on pure reason. But with this insight of Kant that happiness is an idea, we could argue against them, well, even your eudaimonism, for how empirical it is, still is not only empirical. An animal could not be a eudaimonist. An animal does not have a concept, an idea of happiness. Since you have an idea of happiness, since you make your morality about something which you have never experienced and which you can never experience, but rather which you are thinking, a maximum of something limited that you experienced, of the limited welfare you might have experienced, since you're basing your morality on that, without realizing, you're already admitting that morality cannot be based only on experience, that indeed we do need reason for morality. But back to the highest good. I said most people, if asked what do you want in life, what would you wish for if you had one wish, would probably say happiness. But now I would ask such people, are you sure? Are you truly sure that this is all, or this is most of what you want? Reflect on it. Does this mean for you that if you want money, you want to be able to steal the money and get away with it? Or does it mean for you that if you happen to desire sex with a person, you want to be able to rape that person and get away with it? Is that what you mean when you say, what matters most to me in life is my happiness? Now, a truly evil and wanton person might answer with, yes, that's exactly what I mean. I want to be able to just get whatever I desire and to get away with it, even if it means throwing others under the bus. But a person who is not completely despicable will now say, no, one moment, that's not what I meant. Maybe if I desire money, I would like to somehow get that money without working. Maybe I would like to win the lottery. But I would not want to steal it even if I could get away with it. Or maybe if I desire sex with a person, I would wish for that person to want to have sex with me too, to have consensual sex with me, but I would not want to rape that person even if I could get away with it. Indeed, a person who is not completely evil might even say, not only would I not want to gain my happiness in these despicable, in these criminal ways, but rather I could not gain my happiness that way. Because even though I would get what I want, the money, the sex, if I got it by such means, then I could no longer enjoy it, because I would feel bad, because I would have a bad conscience. And this should show you that happiness alone is indeed not the highest good. Kant would call it the highest physical good, or the highest pathological good. In a way, it's just the highest pleasure you can feel. And it is that which we desire as sensual beings. It is that which gives worth to our state, the state we are in, right? If I have welfare, and not just welfare for a time, but permanent welfare, happiness, then the state I find myself in feels good and therefore has value for me. But the thing is, we are not mere animals. In other words, we are not only sensual beings, we are also rational beings. And when it comes to our reason, it's not that it is completely against this goal of happiness, of gaining pleasure, of feeling good. It's not that it says this goal is simply irrational per se, but our reason limits this goal. Our reason says, okay, you can try to gain happiness, but only within the limits that I, reason, set, only within the borders of the moral law. And this leads us to what we could call the highest moral or the highest practical good, according to Kant, which is being able to approve of ourselves, right? Again, reason says, okay, try to gain your happiness, but only through means that I, reason, approve of, or at least through means that I don't disapprove of. And this is not about being happy, but rather it's about being worthy of happiness, right? If you gain money through theft, or if you gain sex through rape, maybe it may feel good to you, but you don't deserve feeling good. Rather, if you act in a righteous manner, then maybe you won't feel good. Maybe something bad will happen to you, or maybe you will not get something you would like to get. But you will deserve feeling good for being a righteous person. So, while the highest physical or pathological good, happiness, gives worth to our state, the highest moral or practical good, being righteous people, gives worth to our person. Not the state I am in now has value to me, but my own person, the person I am, now has value to me. Now, what makes a person? It's freedom. I discussed that in my previous lecture on animal ethics and in the lecture on the legal relationships, that to Kant, all things that exist are either persons or items. And the difference lies in autonomy. An item is anything, dead or alive, unfeeling or feeling, be it a stone, be it an animal, is any being that cannot set its own purpose for itself, that does not have autonomy, but only heteronomy, being determined by something else, by the laws of nature, or by what other beings do to it. On the other hand, a person is anything that has autonomy, that can set its own purpose for itself. In other words, that is free. And that would be any rational being. So that means that our person has more worth, or that our reason can approve more of our person, the more free we are. And that means also the more good we are, because that's the whole point of Kant's moral philosophy. And I discussed that in my lecture on what is freedom, and in my 3 lectures on the categorical imperative, that being free and being good is really the same thing, because being free does not mean doing whatever you desire. Rather, if you follow your sensual desires, you are unfree, right? You're a slave to your desires. But rather, being free means thinking about what you ought to do, what would be the right thing to do, and then doing that, even if it's not what you desire. And this leads not to happiness, but to being self-satisfied. Of course, nowadays, being self-satisfied has a sort of negative connotation. When we call someone self-satisfied, usually we mean that he's somehow arrogant, and usually we are thinking that him being satisfied with himself is somehow not justified, that he's somehow lying to himself. But that's not what Kant means. Kant means this word in the literal sense. You are satisfied with yourself, and rightfully so, because you are free, and therefore yourself, for being free, for being independent, has value. Let me use an example I used in previous lectures. Let's say you're shipwrecked and you survive on a small boat, and there's one other survivor. Let's say it's a child even. And now you are running out of food. And you feel your stomach rolling. You are hungry. Now there's two things you could do. You could, of course, kill the child and become a cannibal. Eat the child in order to survive till you reach a shore. If you do this, it will create welfare, right? You will feel better because you will not feel hungry anymore. You will have a full stomach, and of course you will maybe survive. So you will feel good about your state, the state you are in physically. And that is what leads to happiness. But if you reflect about yourself, you cannot be satisfied with yourself. Precisely because you were not free. You succumbed to your animal desire, to your hunger. You, despite being a rational being, did not follow your rational insight about what you should or shouldn't do, but rather, like an animal, you followed your instincts, your hunger. On the other hand, you could also abstain from eating the child, even as your hunger grows, even if it means that you starve. You could maybe give all the leftover food to the child so that the child will survive till the shore. In this case, you will not feel good about your state that you are in. You will be in pain. Your stomach will be painful because of the hunger. So you will not have happiness. But you can be satisfied with yourself. You can approve of the kind of person you are. And indeed, the more intense the pain, the hunger grows, the more satisfied you can be with yourself. If you still don't give in to the hunger, if you still don't become a cannibal, but rather still do what is right. And why can you be so satisfied with yourself? Because as a rational being, you have thought about what you should do and come to the conclusion that you should not eat the child. And now you are following your own insight rather than the pull of your sensual desire. Meaning, you are free. And it is this freedom, this autonomy, that makes it so that you can approve of yourself, that you can be satisfied with yourself. And as a side note here, Kant also at some point talks about blessedness or felicity, which would be what God has, right? And which would be also what we say the blessed souls have, the souls of the righteous, right? And this is what heaven is. Heaven means being blessed or being felicious. And we might imagine this as living in a nice garden or whatever. But this is really just a sort of metaphor for this feeling of blessedness. And Kant asks, what is blessedness? It is in fact not happiness. So it is precisely not about living in a garden and having nice foods to eat, or having virgins that attend to you or whatever. It's not about being in a state that feels good, but rather it is about approving of your person. Because Kant says being self-satisfied is usually about an isolated moment or an isolated action, right? Now I'm satisfied with myself on this boat because I'm not giving in to hunger, not eating this child. But maybe in the past I was not satisfied with myself. Maybe I did something cowardly, maybe I lied, maybe I did not stand up for others when I should have, maybe I stole, whatever. Well, if you can fully approve of yourself, not just in the moment, not just for a single action, but permanently, then Kant says you are blessed or felicious. But what this would mean is, not only can you fully approve of yourself because so far you have always done what's right, because so far you have never done anything evil. In other words, because you are a very virtuous, righteous person, because then you could still potentially do something evil in the future. You could never be sure that you don't in the future succumb to some temptation. Only if you live conscious of the fact that not only have you never done anything evil, you're not even capable of ever doing something evil, even in the future. You have absolutely zero temptation. Only then could you fully approve of your person and therefore be called blessed. In other words, you would have to be not just virtuous and righteous, you would have to be holy, which is precisely what God is, right? And that is why God is blessed, why God is felicious. Not because he has value in his state, not because he feels happy because of permanent welfare. He is not a physical being, there is no physical pleasure, but because he can fully approve of the person he is, because he's fully free, because he has not even a physical temptation for evil. And also, being fully free, of course, means also not ever being a victim, not ever being dependent on other things for your happiness, right? Even the fully virtuous and righteous person, who always does the right thing, can, of course, in that sense, approve of his person morally, but he would still find himself dependent on the world, right? Even if on the boat you don't eat a child and approve of yourself for that, your stomach will still hurt because you're hungry. That is something you cannot approve of. So, and this still goes against your dignity as a human being, right? Dignity precisely lies in being free, in being autonomous. So whenever you are in the slightest unfree, whenever you are in the slightest dependent, that's an attack on your dignity, and that is something your reason cannot approve of. So again, for God, this is not an issue. God does not depend for his happiness on other things. He does not desire anything that he needs to be happy, and he's not unhappy if he lacks it. Rather, not being a sensual being, there is no such thing as happiness or unhappiness for him, and therefore there is nothing that infringes on his dignity. He has the ultimate freedom, the ultimate autonomy, and therefore he has the ultimate dignity, and therefore he can be fully satisfied with who he is, and therefore he feels fully blessed, fully felicious. And to Kant, Blessedness, therefore, is reserved for God. No human can ever become blessed. Again, he would have to be A, holy, meaning not even capable of doing evil ever, and B, he would have to be independent of the world around him for his own happiness. He would have to be fully free. And therefore Kant says the wise person who comes closest to this, the wise person is an analogon of God. He is sort of the image of God, but he does not fully reach this blessedness. So, of course, Kant talks from what Fichte would call the perspective of lower morality, for which there still is a moral law, a duty, a dichotomy between what my sensual desires might drive me towards and what my rational insight tells me I should do. Fichte says if you reach the state of higher morality, you are indeed holy. Then, like for God himself, there is no shall for you, no duty, only a want, only an I already want what I ought to do. So the ought comes too late, I already want it. And therefore Fichte did indeed give lectures that he called instructions towards a blessed or towards a felicious life, because he talked from this perspective of higher morality and believed this to be possible. But anyways, for Kant, as I said, true blessedness is reserved for God. The wise, the virtuous person can attain an analogon of that, however. And so now, along with the happiness, where I'm content with the state I am in, with how I feel, we also have self-satisfaction, where I'm content with the person I am, with my freedom, my autonomy. And our reason demands the latter, the worth of our person, so much so that we cannot even, if we listen to our reason at all, that is, that we cannot even enjoy the former, the happiness, without this, right? As I already said, if you're not completely wicked, you cannot truly enjoy getting what you desire if you get it through evil means, because you will then have a bad conscience that ruins this enjoyment for you. Now, as a side note, there are these cynical people nowadays that claim that there is no such thing as morality, and that people who claim to be moral or to care about morality are just less honest than they, the cynics, are. That in the end it's all just egoism and everyone just wants to feel good, and that the seemingly moral people don't act moral because it's the right thing to do, but precisely because it's what happens to make them feel good. But here Kant would point out that these cynics are confusing cause and effect. It is certainly true that for a moral person, he feels good when doing something moral. And he would feel bad about doing something immoral. He would have a bad conscience. He would have regrets. But that cannot be the reason for his moral actions or for abstaining from immoral actions, because he already must be a moral person in order to feel good at having done something moral or to feel bad at having done something immoral. If you imagine a completely evil, completely wicked person, you cannot go to such a person and say, oh, don't do this evil thing you're about to do. It's bad for yourself too, because you will be plagued by a bad conscience. If that person is truly wicked, he will just laugh in your face and will say, no, I don't have a bad conscience. I don't care at all if this thing is bad and I shouldn't do it. it's to my advantage, so I will do it. So you already need to be good, at least to some degree, in order to feel bad about doing something bad. And that's an important insight of Kant's that should completely destroy the argument of these cynics. And also, at the same time, it should also show us one reason why people often are so much against Aufklärung, against getting aufklärt. Why they even get angry when you try to aufklär them. Because naively you could think, why? It's to their own good, right? Not only would it turn them into more moral people, it would turn them into more free people, it would turn them into more happy people, right? No one has ever regretted becoming aufklärt in the end. The unaufklärt people are always unhappy, are always ruining their own lives. So why would you not want it? But the first step of Aufklärung is indeed realizing how wicked, how pathetic, how worthless you probably have been so far, and how evil many things you have done in your life have been. Sure, later on, you will stop doing such things, and you will do good things, and you will be able to approve of yourself, and you will actually feel much better about yourself than you ever have. But at first, you will be confronted with your current utter worthlessness. And people sense that, even if they are not fully conscious of that, they sense that. That when someone wants to aufklären them, wants to literally bring them clarity, bring them to self-reflect, well, it means he's holding a mirror up to them, and first they will see how ugly and dirty they are. Sure, they can then use the mirror to remove the dirt, to wash themselves, to become clean, but first they will see how dirty they are. And this is what they are fighting against. But anyways, back to the highest good. We now see that the highest good actually has two parts. Because we as human beings, we ourselves have two sides. We are both sensual and rational beings. And therefore, for us, there's the highest physical or pathological good and the highest moral and practical good. There's that which our sensuality desires and that which our rationality demands. There is the goal of happiness, of constant, permanent welfare. And there is the goal of actually deserving happiness, actually being worthy of happiness. There's the goal of being virtuous, being good. There is having a state that we can agree with, and there is being a person that we can agree with. And so that is also why there are different imperatives. I talked about this in my lecture on the imperatives. There's the hypothetical pragmatic imperative that leads towards happiness, where we use our reason merely as an instrument in order to reach the non-rational, not irrational, but non-rational goal of happiness. And there's the categorical moral imperative, where reason is not just a means to an end, but where reason sets the end, sets the goal, sets the purpose itself. So, in the pragmatic imperative, our reason promises if you do this and that, you will become happy. In the categorical imperative, our reason says you ought to do this. Not for some goal you might have, like happiness, but simply because it's the right thing to do. You ought to do this. And if you do this, I, reason, do not necessarily promise you that you will be happy, but I promise you that you will deserve being happy, that you can at least approve of yourself. This twofold highest good, however, being made up of being happy and of deserving to be happy, cannot just be limited to the individual. Rather, we should look at it from the perspective of the world as a whole. Imagine a being of pure reason that is sort of outside the world and looking at the world from outside. Such a being would be good, would be fully good. It is a being of pure reason, so it has no temptations to ever do evil. Such a being would also be fully blessed. It would not in any way feel bad about itself, precisely because it is good, because it is free. It could fully approve of itself, and it would need nothing else. And also, such a being of pure reason would be completely neutral towards the world when looking at it, right? It would not be inclined to take sides out of irrational reasons. It has no compassion. It does not feel it does not suffer when it sees others suffering. It does not have any sympathies for this or that person. It would be a neutral observer and a neutral judge. Now, even with this neutrality, if such a being were to look at the world and find in this world beings that are rational and therefore under the moral law, therefore not just driven by instincts, where you could say, okay, they are not responsible for their actions, but also at the same time beings that are sensual and therefore capable of feeling good or bad and therefore desiring happiness. In other words, if that purely rational being were to observe beings like us, humans, then now imagine it were to find that all these beings are completely evil and wicked and rotten to the core, yet they are happy. They somehow get what they want. They somehow get away with being so evil. Then this rational being, despite not, so to say, caring on a personal level, it's not like it would suffer because it's not affected by the world, but it would still disapprove on purely rational grounds. It is not rational that there is a world of beings that are under the moral law and yet refuse to follow it, yet are evil, and still these beings are happy. This is not how the world ought to be. But likewise, if this pure rational being found that the beings in the world are all good and virtuous and wise and righteous, yet they are all suffering. I don't know, they are sick or they are hungry, they're exposed to the elements, they're having miserable lives. Again, this being would not suffer personally from this. It would not feel animal-like compassion, but still it would disapprove of such a world. It would say, this is not rational, this is not how it ought to be. These people are good, therefore they don't deserve to suffer, therefore it's not good that they suffer. Now, if you imagine this pure rational being, on top of being dead, also was almighty, in other words, if you imagine this was God, then what it would do, clearly, is hand out happiness to those that are good and righteous and deserving of it, and hand out unhappiness, hand out punishment to those that are evil and wicked. Again, not for any, so to say, personal reasons, but simply because this is rational. This is how it ought to be. The good people should be rewarded, the bad people should be punished. it's not good to have a world where the good are suffering or where the bad are enjoying themselves. And so therefore, this would be the highest good. Not just a single individual should be happy while also deserving to be happy. Rather, the world as a whole should be a world where there's always the right proportion between happiness and being worthy of happiness. There should be a world where the bad people don't enjoy their badness, don't gain happiness through it, and where the good people don't suffer from their goodness, but rather a world where everyone gets what they deserve. This would be the highest good. Or to be more precise, which Kant sometimes is, he would call such a world the highest derivative good, while God would be the highest original good, right? The highest good as such is the proportion between actually being happy and deserving to be happy. Well, in God, as the highest original good, you have precisely that, right? He deserves to be happy, he is completely holy, and he actually is free from all unhappiness, from all suffering. So he already is the highest good, but the original highest good. Such a world, on the other hand, would be derived from God, would be created through God. But if it was a fully good world, the kingdom of heaven, so to say, it would be akin to God. It would be an image to God in the sense that here too, in this world, everyone is righteous. All people are saints, are holy people that deserve happiness. And indeed, everyone gets the happiness that they deserve. So in a sense, there are two highest goods. But for the most part, when Kant talks about just the highest good without a further adjective, without calling it the highest original good or the highest derived good, then he always means the latter. Then he always means the world in which happiness and the worthiness of happiness are congruent with one another. You could also express it another way. I explained in my lecture on what is philosophy to Kant that to him there are two areas philosophy deals with: the realm of nature and the realm of freedom. Therefore, we have theoretical philosophy concerned with being, with what is, and we have practical philosophy concerned with duty, with what ought to be. And I also said that we have our power of judgment with its concept of purposiveness, which sort of builds a bridge between those two, right? Because we can, the purpose is something that belongs to freedom, right? When I act towards a purpose, but we can find purposiveness in nature, in the aesthetical judgment, when we find nature to be beautiful in its form, but also in the teleological judgment, when we find nature to be purposeful in itself, to not be simple chaos, but to be as if created with a purpose. The aesthetical judgment about the beautiful, I already gave a lecture on what the beautiful is to Kant. Teleology, I have not yet discussed. I will discuss that in a later lecture when I get to what Kant has to say about natural science sometime next year, probably. But anyways, this bridge aside, there are these two areas, nature and freedom, and they are separate. That's actually important to Kant, to clearly separate them from one another. But you could say that in our idea of the highest good, there is the demand that they should not simply be completely separate, but rather that nature and freedom should align. That the laws of nature and the laws of morality should run parallel with one another, right? So a good person who follows the laws of morality, who uses his freedom in the right ways, should not find the laws of nature to be an obstacle to him. Nature should not make such a person suffer through, let's say, hunger or sickness or catastrophes, or through the wicked deeds of other immoral people, right? Because this too, of course, belongs to nature in the sense that, let's say, someone stabs me, it is now the laws of nature that make it so that I feel pain or that I die. Well, I shouldn't. If I'm a good person, then I don't deserve feeling pain when I'm stabbed. I don't deserve dying from being stabbed. Just like I don't deserve getting sick or dying in an earthquake or whatever. So the laws of nature should align with the laws of freedom. The world that is should not be the obstacle or the enemy of the person who acts as he ought to act. Again, this would be the highest good. This world where nature and freedom align. Of course, that's not the case. That's not the world we do live in. That's not what Kant claims. But what he claims is it is the world that we demand. And what is very important here is that it is our reason that demands this. It's not our selfishness. It's not that we want this world simply because it would be nice to live in such a world. Because our mere selfishness, our mere egoism, if it finds that the laws of nature and the moral laws do not align with one another, could simply choose to ignore the moral law. Could simply say, okay, then I will live in a way that makes me feel best, that makes me feel the most happy according to the laws of nature as they are. Like, for example, by nature, I have sexual desires, so I might simply rape, and I might simply ditch the moral law, right? So mere selfishness would not demand the highest good. Mere selfishness would be willing to just sacrifice one half of the highest good, the moral half. No, it's not a selfish desire to want this highest good, Kant says. Rather, it is something that reason itself demands. It is not rational, and reason is not satisfied if beings who are good suffer without deserving to suffer, or if beings who are evil are happy without deserving to be happy. That's why previously I talked about the perspective of God, of a pure rational being, to point out that even a neutral being who is not involved in this world and in its suffering or happiness would approve of the highest good being realized and would disapprove of a world that is not the highest good. That's a very important point to Kant. But anyways, now I have explained what the highest good is, but from that arises a problem. From that arises a dialectic of practical reason. I already gave an earlier lecture about what is dialectic to Kant. To him, dialectic means the doctrine of illusion. And what he means by that is an illusion that reason creates for itself. Of course, there can also be illusions that others create for you. There can be sophistry, where someone uses an argument that is wrong, but that seems to be rational, and that does sound convincing to you if you don't really think it through. But this is an arbitrarily created illusion. what you have in dialectic is an illusion that reason creates for itself. So reason in a way fools itself. By the nature of our reason, there arises a wrong argument in ourselves through which we convince ourselves. And this scandal of reason, as Kant says, this scandal that reason in a way tricks and fools itself, is in large parts what he deals with in his critiques. He tries to find the reason these dialectics even arise, and he tries to solve them. And each of his critiques has such a dialectic. I already talked about the dialectic in the Critique of Practical Reason in my 3 lectures on rational psychology, rational cosmology, and rational theology. And I already talked about the dialectic in the Critique of Judgment in my lecture on can we have a dispute about the beautiful, about taste. Well, now it is time to get to the dialectic that Kant discusses in the Critique of Practical Reason. And there are different types of dialectic, but I already pointed out in earlier lectures that the most common type in Kant is the autonomy. Indeed, it's so common that it becomes almost synonymous with dialectic. Only in the Critique of Pure Reason does Kant also discuss other forms of dialectic, the paralogisms and the ideal of reason. But in all other areas, except theoretical philosophy, so in the aesthetical, in his philosophy of right, in his pedagogy, and also here in his moral philosophy, when Kant talks about dialectic, he means an antinomy. What that is, I already explained in more detail in my lecture on rational cosmology, but in brief, by an antinomy, Kant means that we have two opposing possibilities, a thesis and an antithesis, that seem to exclude one another, so they can't both be true. But our reason seems to prove both of them, or seems to disprove both of them. Right? That's a specific kind of dialectics. Again, it could also be another one, like in the paralogisms, it is only one side that reason seems to prove. So there's only a thesis, no antithesis. But when you have an antinomy, Kant says you have two opposing positions that seem to both at the same time be true or both at the same time be untrue, which of course cannot be. And this is precisely what we are confronted with here when it comes to the idea of the highest good. Since it has these two halves, happiness and righteousness, which makes us deserving of happiness, the question arises, what is the relationship of these two halves? How are they connected? How do they depend on one another? Which half should we strive for? And this is where we get into this dialectic, into this antinomy. We can turn here first to the philosophy of the ancient Greeks. Kant says the main question for modern moral philosophy is that of the foundation of morality. Where does the moral law come from? Why should we even be moral? Why do we ought to act morally? He says for the ancient Greeks, that was not a question they asked at all. It was sort of a given that you should be virtuous, that it is better to be virtuous than not be virtuous, and the question was not really raised why you should be virtuous. What their main question was, Kant says, is precisely the question for the highest good and for the relationship of virtue and happiness. And Kant says this was their error. This should not be the highest question of moral philosophy. However, what he does acknowledge and what he does praise them for is that since they did make it the highest question, they thought about it thoroughly and they tried all possible solutions there are, except one, except the critical solution that Kant formulates. Namely, what he says is, on the one hand, you have the ancient Epicureans, who, between the two halves of the highest good, essentially said that happiness is the more important half, that you should strive to be happy in life, and that the other half, virtue, being righteous, is really just a means to an end, that through being virtuous, you will attain happiness. On the other hand, you have the Stoics, who sort of turned things around and said, no, it's not happiness that matters, it is virtue that matters. Virtue is not a means to an end to attaining happiness, but virtue is the end goal. And the wise person, the proper virtuous person, does simply not care about happiness. And through that, through being virtuous, you will also sort of accidentally become happy, or rather you will stop being unhappy because you stop caring about your happiness, but what really matters is virtue. And those are the two schools that in one way or the other care about the highest good as Kant describes it, but who sort of sacrifice one half and sort of overemphasize the other half. You also have the ancient cynics, Kant says, who in a way abandon both halves and who preached a merely negative ideal, saying live an ideal of simplicity, as Kant calls it. Live as simple a life as possible, live as natural a life as possible, so in a way sink beneath your humanity, live just as an animal, and through this you will not attain positive happiness, you will not gain anything, any luxury goods or whatever, but you will attain a sort of negative happiness. You will not be unhappy because you don't make yourself dependent on anything. And likewise, through this cynic lifestyle, you will not attain positive virtue, you will not be a good person in a positive sense because you have worked on yourself, but you will attain a sort of negative virtue. You will not be a bad person because you will not let society turn you wicked, and you will not develop all sorts of dependencies and desires for luxury that might make you do evil actions. So, in a negative sense, you will attain both halves of the highest good. And the fourth and last option is Platonism, where Kant says, while the cynics sort of stay beneath the highest good, the Platonists sort of try to rise above it. To them, the highest good is neither earthly happiness, which they don't care about, nor is it earthly virtue, which they don't care about much either, but rather the highest good is in the divine and in a sort of mythical unification with the divine, what mystics would call the unio mystica. So to put it into Kant's terminology, which in this case he actually doesn't, but to put it into his terminology, we could say, since he makes this difference between the highest original and the highest derived good, to the Platonists, they dismiss the highest derived good, right? The world in which happiness and worthiness of happiness align. To them, simply by virtue of being derived, of being merely an image of God, it already loses its worth, and they want to go straight to the highest original good, to God, in whom there is complete blessedness and complete worthiness, and they want to directly unify with that. And these are the 4 attempted solutions that the ancient philosophy offers us, according to Kant. And according to Kant, these are also all the solutions that you could possibly give. Again, excluding his own solution, which I will get to later on. And this leads me back to something I keep saying throughout these lectures, that if you want to study philosophy systematically, not just as a rhapsody of different opinions out of which you might pick out the one you like best, if you want to have a systematic understanding of it, you should start by studying Kant. Because not only will it help you understanding Kant's own philosophy, right? That is true for every philosopher, of course. If you study him, then you gain a better understanding of his own thoughts. But with Kant, you actually gain a better understanding of the thoughts of others as well. It's like sort of Kant, since he has worked on the fundament, he sort of gives you a map where each other philosophy can be placed. And right, because these other ancient philosophers here in this example, they don't necessarily use the words highest good, or they don't necessarily say, okay, the highest good could have these 2 halves, and then to me this half is more important, or that half is more important. That's all Kant. But through this lens, we can gain much more clarity about these ancient philosophers. Maybe more clarity than they themselves had about themselves, right? That's also something Kant says, that you can understand an author better than he understood himself, potentially. And this is where Kant can be so helpful. And of course, this systematic understanding does not just apply for what was the past for Kant, for the philosophy that came before him and that therefore he could know and discuss, but also it applies to what for Kant was still the future, for the philosophy that came after him. This philosophy, of course, Kant himself did not discuss, but we can also better understand it through the systematic lens of Kant, meaning also for thinkers that came after him, we can ask this question: what was the highest good to them? Which side of the highest good mattered to them? Let me give just 2 examples from the 19th century, so the century after Kant. On the one hand, you have the socialists. To the socialists, clearly, what mattered always was the physical or pathological half of the highest good, so the happiness. The socialists want a world where everyone is happy. But the other half, the virtue, the being worthy of happiness, that's not something they concern themselves with much. And that's precisely the issue, right? So either they don't care about this at all, right? Like many leftists will just say, okay, we want a world with less suffering. They want a world where people are more happy, and they don't even ask the question, do people even deserve this? Are these the kind of people that would deserve happiness? Or often they would say something along the lines of, with the happiness, the worthiness will come. It's an afterthought. It's a result of the happiness. In other words, if people live in a world that deprives them of happiness, they turn wicked. But if we create a world where everyone is happy, then no one will have a reason to be wicked anymore, and then people will be good, right? Like the socialists would say stuff like, okay, sure, the workers, many of them suffer from alcoholism, or they beat their wives and children, or they rape or whatever. But this is just because of the conditions they live under. If we create a classless society free of capitalism and so on, then everyone will be good, right? Or nowadays you will have certain feminists talking as if rape is just a result of the patriarchy, and if we just get rid of the patriarchy, then people will just be good and not hurt each other anymore. On the other hand, let's consider someone like Nietzsche. To Nietzsche, this happiness for everyone is precisely not what he envisions. Rather, he despises this ideal. He says this is for the weak, this is for those with slave morality. They want to be passive, they want to indulge, they want to end their suffering and to lie down on a soft cushion. They want what he calls the Sabbath of Sabbath, which to him is deeply pathetic and despicable. And that's an important point, because that helps fighting off certain misinterpretations of Nietzsche. Sure, Nietzsche did criticize morality, and he did envision an Übermensch, a superhuman who is beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche calls it. But some superficially think, okay, so the Übermensch will be a selfish egoist who's just out for his own gain, for his own advantage, in other words, for his own happiness. No, there's nothing superhuman about that. If anything, that is below humanity. That is what the animal already wants. It's certainly not rising above humanity. And so therefore, this would be a pathetic goal to Nietzsche that is not befitting of the Superman. No, rather, if you ask what does Nietzsche want from human beings, he doesn't want them to be more happy. He wants them to be greater, to be more sublime, to be more terrible, to be more incredible. In other words, you could say he wants them to be worth more, to be more worthy, to have a higher value as persons. Now, Nietzsche himself would probably not use this phrase. He would probably not talk about the Superman being more worthy. And especially he would not talk about him being more worthy of happiness. But that's just because happiness doesn't concern him at all. Because it plays so little role in his philosophy that he doesn't even ask when it comes to the topic of worthiness, worthy of what? Worthy of happiness. But still, you could say that to him, what matters is not the physical half of the highest good, not the actual happiness, but what matters to him is the other half, that which gives the human, that which gives the person worth and value. While for the socialists, you could say it's a sort of Epicureanism turned from the individual towards society, turned into the political. And it's on that note, it's no coincidence maybe that Karl Marx wrote his dissertation on Epicurus. But I hope with these examples you can see how helpful Kant's philosophy once again can be to understand all thinking, how it can help you in the interpretation, in the systematic understanding of all important thinkers. But with that, let's get to what Kant himself says about the highest good. And at first, you should note that Kant very strictly separates the two halves, saying here in this world, they don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, right? Nowadays, many people might agree. Nowadays, many people would say, sure, you can maybe be happy as a wicked person. Maybe it's this wickedness that makes you happy, maybe because you are so ruthless and selfish, you gain whatever you want, whatever is to your advantage. And on the other hand, you can be virtuous, you can be good, and can be unhappy. Maybe because of that, right? Because you are so selfless, because you don't do what's easy or what is to your advantage, but rather you do what's right. So in that sense, both halves are disconnected and have nothing directly to do with each other. That was not always so self-evident, and not always everyone would have agreed with it so easily. Rather, for the longest time, till Kant's own day, most people would probably have taken it as a given that being virtuous is also the most likely thing to make you happy, that being virtuous is to your advantage and being evil is at the same time being dumb because it's really to your disadvantage if you think about it. For Kant, both halves are separate in this world. Virtue does not necessarily lead to happiness, and happiness does not necessarily lead to virtue. And to him, this is actually a good thing, considered from the perspective of morality. Because, sure, you could imagine a world where good deeds always make you happy and evil deeds always make you unhappy. And in such a world, probably everyone would do good and no one would do evil. So, in a sense, it would be paradise. But Kant says this would be a very questionable paradise, because here people would not be good because they are good. They would just act good because it's to their own advantage, right? So this would destroy morality itself. If morality was also the most prudent thing to do, then you could never be sure that anyone even is moral, even if they act that way. It could all be for their selfish self-interest. Of course, you could also claim that what does it matter if people are moral or not? What matters is that no one has to suffer unjustly. But Kant says, if that was the case, if the worth of the world lied not in us doing the right thing and becoming happy in doing the right thing out of our own free choice because we decided to do it, but rather if the world was just about us doing the right thing and being happy, no matter why we do the right thing, then God would have made a big mistake giving us freedom, giving us autonomy at all. Then it would be better if we were just like puppets, like programmed robots. Then it would be better if we just had a natural instinct that automatically made us do the right thing, right? Because that would be a much, if this was the goal, then that would be a much safer way of reaching that goal. But then, if that was how the world was, the world would be completely worthless. Okay, yeah, everyone in the world would always do the right thing and everyone in the world would always feel happy. That's nice. But why should such a world even exist in the first place? I mean, God could look at it from the outside and could find that it looks nice because, again, everyone is happy and everyone is acting in a good way. But since he would know that they're only doing the right thing because he sort of programmed them to, then what's the point, right? What's the point of it all? He could just not have created this world. Here it's important to realize that happiness as the highest physical or pathological good is only a subjective good, Kant says, while the highest practical or moral good of virtue, only that is an objective good. What he means by this is that being happy is a subjective good because it's good for you, the subject, for the person who wants to be happy. This means that, okay, if beings exist in the world that are capable of feeling happy or feeling unhappy, then for them, subjectively, being happy is a good, is something they strive for. If we already exist, then, yeah, we would rather exist in a state of happiness than in a state of unhappiness. But why should we exist at all? Why does it have worth that we exist at all? Here you can think of the fact that many atheists nowadays would claim that they are atheists because of the theodicy problem, right? Because they say there cannot be a good God with all the suffering in the world. So to them, the fact that people that exist are not happy, in spite of not deserving being unhappy, that is an argument against God. I have, however, not heard any atheist complaining that people who don't exist are not happy, and that this is an argument against God. Right? So someone might say, oh, there are so many people alive on Earth that actually exist that are unhappy and shouldn't be unhappy. Therefore, there cannot be a God. But no one is saying, oh, there are no people alive on the moon or on Mars or on Venus. And therefore, there are also no happy people there, since there are no people at all. And this is an argument against God. If there was a God, he should have created more happy people. Nobody says that. So in other words, if someone already exists, then yes, reason says they should be happy unless they don't deserve it. But reason does not say that the existence of happy beings as such has any worth. If no beings at all would exist, then the lack of their happiness would also not be a problem. On the other hand, that beings exist who are free, who have their own dignity, their own inner worth, and that they use their freedom to do the right thing out of their own free will, that has worth in itself. And here we could say it's better that a world exists where someone chooses morality out of his own free will, rather than that such a world does not exist. So if we were just programmed to do the right thing and be happy, if we would just do it out of instinct, okay, that would be nice for us. We would be like happy cows on the meadow, happily eating grass. But nothing would be lost to an observer, a pure rational being, to God, if he had just not created us, if we just didn't exist. If, however, we exist as free beings, and now freely choose to do the right thing, and then gain happiness, then our existence actually has worth, and then an observer could actually approve of that. That's a very important point to cut. And so, in a way, it's good that the highest good is not realized, but rather that it is the end goal, the final purpose of morality. It is what we work towards. And if you think about it, all moral actions work towards realizing the highest good. They are all about either giving people the happiness they deserve, or taking away the unhappiness they don't deserve, or the moral actions are about making people better, making others more virtuous, and thereby making them more deserving of happiness, right? If I see someone drowning and I pull him out, well, he probably doesn't deserve to drown. So this is not in line with the highest good. So me pulling him out brings the world a tiny bit closer towards the highest good. If on the other hand I meet, let's say, a racist, well, he's a piece of shit who doesn't deserve to be happy. If now I try to get him out of his racism, if I talk to him, if I try to aufklär him and try to make him a better person, and if I actually succeed, and get him to a point where he sees people of other races as also having dignity, then maybe he has not actually become happier because nothing else changed in his life, but he has gained in inner worth. He is now not a piece of shit anymore. And now I can't say anymore it would be better if he didn't exist, but now I can actually say it's good that this person exists. He is an enrichment to the world and he deserves being happy, even if maybe he isn't right now. So, all moral actions are not done for the sake of the highest good. That's what I said at the beginning, right? We should act morally simply because it's the right thing to do, not because we want to achieve any goal with it. But the goal that inevitably we would achieve with it would be the highest good. If not just some people, but everyone was virtuous and did the right thing, then we would realize the highest good here in this world. Then it would be the kingdom of heavens, the kingdom of God, Kant says, realized here in this world. In this task of realizing the highest good on earth, the right, the just law, plays a negative role. Because I talked about Kant's philosophy of right extensively for several lectures. And again, I made it clear that to Kant, all right is about what he calls the mine and yours, about property, what belongs to me and what belongs to others. And he says when the mine and yours is not secured, in the state of nature, when there are no laws, there's a war of all against all. And I'm not safe in having and in keeping what is mine. And he says all public right, in all three of its levels. There's states' right within one state. There's the right of nations between different states. And there's the cosmopolitan right for the world as a whole and for states and people that are making first contact, so to say. But in all of its levels, the public right has exactly one task. And that is suum quicque tribur, give to each his own. Meaning, secure the mine and yours. Make sure I have my property, the other person has his property, and we all have a guarantee that we will keep what is ours. And therefore, the right should end this war of all against all. Therefore, the right has exactly one task, and that is to create perpetual peace. Right? The state's right is to create peace between individuals in one state. There should not be a wild jungle, a wild west, or whatever. The right of nations is to create peace between states. There should not be an international anarchy where the strong do to the weak whatever they want, but rather there should be international law that secures there is world peace. And the cosmopolitan right should make the other two possible, should therefore lie the foundation for peace on earth. And you could say that this perpetual peace, which is the goal of all right, Kant therefore calls it the highest juridical good, as opposed to the highest ethical good, which would be happiness and the worthiness of happiness. And you could say maybe that this highest juridical good is the highest negative good, because it prevents certain bad things. It prevents a war. It brings peace, and Kant says the war is the destroyer of everything that is good. And as long as there's still war on earth, the highest positive good, so the highest ethical good, cannot possibly be realized, right? Not everyone can be happy and not everyone can be a good person deserving of happiness while there's still war on earth, while the mine endures is still not secured, while people are still fighting over what belongs to whom. But the perpetual peace is only, so the highest juridical good is only the highest negative good. Because even if there was perpetual peace on earth, the highest ethical, the highest positive good would not automatically be realized. Because people would not necessarily be happy, right? If there was no war, sure, many reasons for being unhappy would no longer be in place, but you could still be unhappy. People could still die from sicknesses, from natural disasters or whatever. And also, if there was no war, people would not necessarily be good and deserving of happiness. Many evil deeds would not happen, sure, but if there is perpetual peace because of the right, because there's laws, then that means this peace is not founded on true friendship and cooperation, but rather this peace is it's built on force, right? It's enforced peace. There is law and the law is enforced. People are forced to leave each other and to leave each other's property alone, and they will do so out of self-interest because they don't want to be punished. So both halves of the highest ethical good will not automatically be realized if we have perpetual peace. But both halves cannot be realized if we do not have perpetual peace. It is therefore a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the highest ethical good. So you could say that when Kant speaks of the highest good, you can understand this in various terms, right? You can talk of the highest juridical or negative good, which is perpetual peace. You can talk of the highest ethical or positive good, which is in turn made up of the highest physical or pathological good, which is happiness, and of the highest practical or moral good, which is being deserving of happiness, being virtuous. And all of this together is just the highest derived good, as opposed to God as the highest original good. But again, usually when Kant just says the highest good without further adjective, he always means the highest ethical good, so happiness and people being deserving of happiness. I think this clarification is also helpful to once again better understand Kant's philosophy of right, including better understand his concept of despotism. I gave a lecture about republicanism and despotism where I said that to Kant, these are the two manners in which a state can be governed, in a republican or in a despotic way. And again, all right has this one negative task of realizing perpetual peace and therefore realizing the necessary condition, creating the necessary fundament, you could say, on which people could then work towards the highest positive good. And if the state does that, it's republican. And now we could say that if the state misunderstands its own purpose and tries to not just realize the highest negative good of perpetual peace, but rather the highest positive good, then it turns despotic. And I would claim that through this, we can, as Kant would say, understand Kant better than he understood himself. We can bring more clarity into his concept of despotism than even he himself had. Because Kant mostly talks about one possibility. He says the state is despotic when it tries to make people happy. It should, like the American Declaration of Independence says, right? It says everyone has the right to pursue his own happiness. So the state should give the people the freedom to try to become happy, if they don't hurt others' rights in the process. But the state should not actively try to make the people happy. If it does so, it is paternalistic and thereby despotic. And this is, for example, I would say, one issue with the various socialist projects, right? This is why they always turn despotic. It's not, as some of their followers would claim, that, let's say, communism was just misunderstood and abused and misused to justify despotism. Rather, it is, I would say, ingrained in the project itself, even if the project is well-meaning, that it must turn despotic. Because if you try to enforce happiness, if you try to make people happy, the state will be despotic. But this is just the one side, the one Kant talks about. I would say the state is also despotic when it tries to realize the other half of the highest positive good, that is virtue. Because there are also states that maybe don't try to make their subjects happy. Maybe people are very unhappy there, maybe they are lacking and wanting lots. But these states try to make the people more virtuous, or at least whatever the rulers of the states think is virtuous. This is particularly true if the state claims to be a religious state, right? Then it will probably tell its people what to wear. It will probably tell its people what kind of sex they can have, like only sex within marriage, no gay sex, and so on. And this is also despotic, because people should turn themselves virtuous. You cannot enforce virtue. This is not just despotic, meaning this is not just the state misunderstanding its own job, but on top of that, it's also completely dumb and absurd in this case. Because not only should you not force someone to be virtuous, you cannot. All you can enforce is outer actions, but not inner attitude. So virtue, or religion for that matter, is not something you can force onto people, even if your concept of virtue was right, which of course in these cases is very questionable, but let's say they are right and you shouldn't be gay or whatever. But even then, all they can force people to do is outwardly following these actions, but not inwardly having the proper goodwill. So I would say, based on Kant, we can call a state despotic if it tries to realize the highest positive good, whether the one half or the other, whether trying to enforce happiness or to enforce virtue. Rather, the proper, the just, the Republican state only realizes the highest negative good, realizes perpetual peace, guarantees to each their own, to each their property, and leaves the highest positive good to the people. And this is then what we should do. We should strive to realize the highest good. Now, while I did say that Kant clearly separates the two halves of it, and that is actually important that he does this, at the same time, he would not say, as certain cynics would do, especially nowadays, that both halves never align at all. That being a good person will just make you unhappy, and being a bad person will lead to more happiness or whatever. No. In fact, Kant would say that most of the time they do align. Most of the time, being selfish, being evil, will not bring happiness. It will just bring a short-term profit. Kant says, sure, the thief may gain some money, but then he gets caught and they hang him. Or sure, a trader, a merchant, he can of course commit fraud and trick a customer and gain some money through that, but when that story spreads, he will lose all his customers. While the honest tradesman, the honest merchant, will see his customers returning. So Kant would say that most of the time, both align. And I already pointed that out in many previous lectures. I gave several lectures on happiness, where I pointed out that this is true for the individual. In your individual life, the virtuous life is for the most part also the life that leads to happiness and also to health, by the way. It's also the most healthy life, according to Kant. And in my earlier lecture on pragmatic versus moral politics, I pointed out that the same is true not just for the individual, but also for politics, also for societies, also for the state. Most of the time, what is politically right is actually also to our advantage, right? It's right not to support despots like in Muscovy or like in Saudi Arabia or in the Emirates. And it's also more prudent not to depend on their oil or their gas, but rather to produce our own energy if we can, right? Or it would have been right not to completely colonize and to completely destroy the Middle East and not to support despots there. And it would also have prevented lots of problems for us. So in politics too, mostly what makes us happy, what is to our advantage, and what is the right thing to do, what makes us worthy of happiness, mostly those align. And Kant even says that when they don't align, it's usually because of time. It's usually because human life is so short. That is why some bad people get away with it. Kant is convinced that given more time, more or less any wicked person would end up on the gallows eventually. And I think this is generally true. I mean, just think of despots. Eventually, despotisms tend to fall, right? They don't last forever. Like, consider the Nazis. Eventually, Hitler fell and lost his power. Now, sure, some despots die at the height of their power, like Stalin in the Soviet Union, or like Franco in Spain, or like the first two Kims in North Korea. But again, Kant would say this is probably just because humans don't live longer. They could not, their dictatorships could not hold forever. They will break down eventually. Like in the case of Stalin or Franco, these dictatorships are gone by now, right? So, and there's no reason to believe they would have lasted forever if the dictator had just stayed alive and other people hadn't taken over. So really, Kant says it's just time, it's just the brevity of our life, which make it so that some wicked people get away with it. In the long run, you would probably eventually always run into problems and always get more or less what you deserve. But still, we do have a brief life. And even though if most of the time doing the right thing and doing the thing that is best for you actually comes down to doing the same thing. There are, of course, instances where this is not the case. If you live in a despotic regime, it might be the right thing to stand up against it, but you're probably risking your life, right? In the Nazi time, if you protested, like the White Rose, like the siblings Sophie and Hans Scholl, you were murdered. So here, doing what you should do and doing what is best for your happiness are not the same thing. And it is precisely these instances, even if they are fewer than most people believe, even if they are just a few extreme situations, that matter, that give us the question, what if I can't have both, being happy and deserving to be happy, what should I prioritize? Now, for most people, it really goes without saying, and it is more or less self-evident, that you would rather pick happiness. And it speaks to the utter wickedness of our age that people don't believe that they will lose all respect in saying that, and that they are actually right in their belief, that they actually really don't lose the other people's respect when they say stuff like, oh, in the time of the Nazis, it was surely heroic and a good thing to do to hide a fleeing Jew, but I would not have done it. Well, yeah, then you are a piece of shit. Then you are utter scum of the earth if you would not have done it. How can you just say that? Even if it's true, I would feel ashamed to say something like that. Or to take more current examples, if people say, yeah, I would, yeah, sure, Muscovy or China or so on, they are despotic regimes. They are committing genocide against the Ukrainians, against the Uyghurs. But I still want their gas, or I still want a new smartphone and I will still buy there. Or, yeah, sure, there's a climate crisis and that's a big issue, but I still want to fly on vacation, or I still want to eat meat daily, or I still want to drive everywhere by car. People don't think they are really saying anything bad about themselves if they are saying stuff like that. Even more so, if after them saying that, you call them what they are, evil, they get offended. They say, how dare you call me evil? And this goes to show that they want their own advantage. They want their own selfish happiness and not to bother with being moral. But on top of that, they also want a nice feeling of also being moral. They want to still keep their decorum. They still want to be considered decent people. And they still want to be able to consider themselves decent people. They want to not bother with any of the hardships of actually being virtuous. But they still want to feel and be considered as if they were virtuous. So they want to have their cake and eat it too. Or as we say in German, they want their pelt washed, but not to get wet in the process. And if you look at how many people are talking or behaving, it really comes down to, yeah, sure, if I can, on top of being happy, also be a good person without the slightest disadvantage, without the slightest loss to my happiness, then sure, I will take that too, because I can feel better about myself then, right? But my happiness comes first. So when it comes to the climate, they would probably say, sure, if you can give me an electric car instead of my fossil fuel powered car, then I will take it, but I still want to drive by car everywhere, every day. So essentially, I want everything to feel exactly the same. I want to be able to consider myself a good person, but I don't want to make the slightest sacrifices for it. Being good should not cost anything. But isn't this how every criminal, big or small, thinks? I would like to be good. I would like to do what's right, but my happiness is more important to me and I'm not willing to make sacrifices. I mean, Kant at least is convinced that even the evil people would want to be good if they could combine that with their own selfish goals. He's convinced that no one is so evil as to have an actively evil will, wanting to act against the moral law just because it is the wrong thing to do. That would not be human, that would be devilish. Rather, they just don't want to follow the moral law if they feel too restricted by it, right? So let's take the thief. He wants to get money. That in itself is not evil. If he was trying to get money through honest means, that would be okay. The problem is that he says getting money is more important to me than being honest. But he doesn't want to steal for theft's sake, right? If he could gain the same money through honest means easily, like if someone were to gift him lots of money, if someone were to gift him millions, he would probably not bother stealing. Or likewise the rapist. The rapist wants sex, let's say. That in itself is not an evil goal. It's just evil that he does not want sex within the bounds of the moral law, which would be consensual sex, but rather that sex is more important to him than following the moral law. But he too is probably not raping for rape's sake. So if his victim would have sex with him willingly, he would probably take it. But since his victim is unwilling, he chooses that him getting off is more important than what his victim wants or not. And I mean, even the Nazis, they said the Germans are people without space, and we need living space in the East, and we need to conquer this space for us. I mean, if there had been completely empty space where no one needs to be conquered and driven out and killed off, they would probably have taken it. It's not that they wanted to kill people for the mere fun of it. But they said this is not possible. They said it's us or them. There's not enough space on this earth for all of us. And then the German people or the Aryan race comes first. That's it. So this precisely is the attitude of an evil person. And that's why you should not tell yourself that you're so different from that. Right? If you too put your happiness first and following the moral law second, if you make being moral conditioned on it not involving sacrifices to your happiness, when actually you should make searching your happiness conditioned on it not involving sacrifices to your moral virtue. So the person who in the Nazi times would not hide a fleeing Jew, but would rather try to be a fellow traveler, try to not get in trouble, you cannot just say, okay, unfortunately that person did not act in a heroic manner, but he was not evil, right? He did not want anything bad for the Jew, he was just not heroic. No, this person was evil. This person said essentially, my life is worth more than that Jew's life. I'm rather willing to risk his life rather than my life. And that is evil. That is all that evil is. And of course, I can imagine how many people will not like to hear that? And how many people will want to disagree with Kant and with me? And one attack will, of course, be, oh, you or Kant, you're just moral braggers, but you're no better than the rest of us. It's easy to sit there and talk about this, but if you were in that situation, you also would be no better. You also would rather save your own life than save someone else's life. To that, my response would be, first, of course, you cannot know this. This is simply you telling yourself that. So you don't have to feel bad about you yourself being a bad person, because you tell yourself, well, everyone else is equally bad. Of course, not everyone else is equally bad. There are people who have risked and even lost their lives to do what is right. Now, would I be one of them? Would Kant have been one of them? Well, the truly honest answer would be, you cannot know, and we ourselves cannot fully know. I mean, and I have addressed this in previous lectures, like my lecture on the goodwill. Kant would say, don't confuse your own good wishes with a true goodwill, with a true moral attitude. So sure, you can say, I wish to do good. I wish to give everyone enough money to eat. If I was a billionaire, I would give all my money. Kant would say, you don't have to think you're a good person because of this wish. Because if you became a billionaire, maybe you would not do it. Maybe you would not give away your money. And likewise, I can say, I wish I would stand up in the face of despotism, even if it costs my life. I cannot think of myself as a good person, as a hero, just because I have this wish. Because, yes, maybe if it actually came to that situation, I would not do what I wish for. Maybe I would turn out to be a coward. So that's important to Kant. Don't confuse your own good wishes with a truly goodwill, a truly moral attitude. How moral you really are, you can only know from experience, from being in that situation and seeing how you actually acted. But then, Kant would also say it does not matter to know how moral we are, or how moral someone else is for that matter. All that matters is that we know what would be moral, what is our moral obligation, and that we try to follow it. Would or wouldn't we actually follow it? Only experience could tell. But at least this should be our aim. So the honest thing to say would be, yes, maybe in such a situation, I or Kant would also not act good. But we would both want to act good. And that's all you can do. Want for yourself to be good and try to be good. And if it turns out you aren't, then next time try to be better. But of course, such attacks are just a distraction. Because in the end, it's not about me and it's not about Kant. I'm not sitting here to say, oh, I am such a good person, or Kant was such a good person. I'm sitting here to say everyone should be a good person, and this is what a good person would do. And if it happens that I'm not a good person or that Kant is not a good person, it doesn't change what a good person is. It doesn't change what we all ought to do, even if maybe we also don't do it. And people just use this as a distraction to be able to tell themselves, well, if no one is good, then I'm excused too. I don't have to be good either. When in fact, even if no one had ever been good so far, that would still not be an excuse to not be the first good person in the history of the world. The issue is not with me or Kant or anyone else for that matter being not up to the standard the moral law sets. The issue is not with people being partially evil. The issue is with people not wanting to hear that they are evil. Because if you are willing to hear it, if you are willing to admit, yes, I'm not perfect. Yes, I maybe in certain situations wouldn't act morally, but that is a problem. I should act morally, so I should change. Then that can be the basis for changing. But if, on the other hand, you just tell yourself, no, I'm already fine as I am, and even if I would not act morally in certain situations, that's okay because it's only human and that's understandable and no one would act morally in those situations, then you have prevented all possibility of ever becoming better. Which should show once again that the true radical evil, I already gave a lecture about what Kant has to say about that, that the true radical evil is the lie, is humans' ability to lie to themselves, to tell themselves that what they are doing is fine, when in truth it isn't. And this is also why in my lecture on why you shouldn't lie under any circumstances, and in my other lecture on conscientiousness, I stress this so much. You must be conscientious first. You must be honest with yourself first about your morality. Otherwise, you can be as immoral as you want and always tell yourself it's fine. So this complaint or this disagreement saying, oh, you or can't you just say this, but you wouldn't be better yourselves, this is therefore worthless. There might also be another complaint. People might once again complain that this is rigorism. I gave a lecture about that too already, about the question, is Kant's morality too strict and too rigorous, too unrealistic? And people might say that's the case. They might complain, you are being too extreme if you say that the person who just wouldn't save the fleeing Jew in the Nazi time because he was afraid for his own life, or the person who keeps driving with his car even during the climate crisis because it's more comfortable, if you put them on one level with the murderer or the rapist, you're being too extreme. You are demanding too much. You're being morally too rigorous. But the fact of the matter is they are on one level. That's simply how it is. And the only way you can disagree is if you are unaufklärt, and like all unaufklärt people, you are a prisoner of your sensuality. Because on the outside, in the sensual world, so by what you can perceive, what you can see, what you can feel, and so on, you might say that there's a difference. You might say that the rapist with his sexual drive and the person who does not save the fleeing Jew with his drive to stay alive, you might say that the latter has a much stronger drive, that it's much easier to abstain from some sexual pleasure than to abstain from being alive. And you will probably be right. Or likewise, you might say that the murderer is more directly killing someone, while he who drives in his car or flies in a plane when he doesn't have to is only more indirectly contributing to people dying. And again, you might be right in the sensual world. But the whole point, as I explained in my previous lecture on Kant's moral philosophy, the whole point is that you should abstract from the sensual and that you should look at the underlying laws, at the underlying principles. What matters in morality is not what you do or don't do in the sensual world. That's largely not because of you, that's largely because of coincidences, of the situations that life thrust you into. No, matters is your attitude. What matters is the principles you take up. If your principle is, I want to follow my drives, even if it makes me act against the moral law, then there's no difference whether you just have the drive to be alive in a dictatorship and therefore don't stand up, or whether you have a sexual drive and therefore you rape. In both situations, you chose to rather submit to your drive than to the moral law. So what matters is, do you have the goodwill or not? What matters is, what principle do you follow in life? And here, I've said it before, there is only two possible principles when it comes to this. Either fiat justitia et pereat mundus, let there be justice even if the world perishes, or the opposite, fiat mundus et pereat justitia, let there be the world, meaning let there be my advantage, even if justice perishes over it. If the latter is your principle, then you already are evil by principle. What this principle, this maxim of yours leads to, if it leads to you actively committing a crime or just passively letting it happen, that's not really up to you. That again depends on coincidences. The particular time and situation you're in, the particular drives you have, the particular way you were raised, and so on and so on. All things for which you can neither be praised nor blamed. The only thing that's really up to you is your maxim. And if your maxim is evil, if your maxim says, my happiness matters more to me than following the moral law, then you are evil already. But of course, I know that I can talk and talk and talk as much as I want, and I could give the best arguments possible. For many people, it would not matter. Many people cannot be convinced by rational arguments. Many people are deaf to reason, because the unaufklärt, they are so much enslaved by their sensuality that they cannot abstract from it and they cannot think in principles. And to them, it's simply impossible to understand that two things that essentially might look very different or might have a very different gravity, that in front of the court of reason, they might be the very same because they might be based on the very same principle. Many won't understand that. But for that reason, I should not just deal with the possible arguments against what Kant has to say or what I have to say. Rather, I would tell a person who tries to argue against this to self-reflect instead. I would remind people that Aufklärung is first and foremost self-criticism, not criticism of the others. It's easy to say, oh, I don't like what Kant is saying. It's easy to say, oh, that's moral bragging, Kant himself would not be better, or oh, that's viduism, that's too extreme, you cannot throw all in the same group and say that the active murderer is no worse than the one who just passively, out of cowardice, lets it happen. It's easy to criticize others, but you should rather criticize yourself. So I invite you to employ Kant's critical method, but that is, I discussed in its own lecture, but simply put, it means don't just focus on where others are wrong, even if they might actually be wrong. Rather, seek the sources of their and of your opinion. There must be a reason why something seems to be right or seems to be wrong to a person. And that reason can be entirely entirely independent of that something actually being right or being wrong. So you should ask yourself, if you disagree with Kant, why? Not why is Kant wrong, but rather why does he seem to be wrong to you? So why would you, for example, think it's justified in the Nazi time to not help the fleeing Jew, even though you yourself admit that it would be good to help the fleeing Jew? I mean, that's a self-contradiction. Kant says, if we judge something to be good, that means we judge it something that should happen. We judge it something that should be done. That's what good means. And then you cannot say, okay, saving the Jew is something that should be done, but at the same time it should not be done. At the same time, it's okay to not do it. It's a glaring self-contradiction. So why would that seem true to you when it's so obviously self-contradictory? And, well, as human beings, we have both reason, we have sensuality. So one of the two must be the source of your opinion. And it should be very obvious that it's not reason. It's not reason who says this. Because why would reason say it's more reasonable that you stay alive and the Jew dies rather that the Jew stays alive and that maybe you die? I mean, is there a reason why his life should be worth less than yours? Or when we have people saying, yeah, okay, sure, other states like China, like Moscow, might be despotic and still we trade with them. But if we don't trade with them, it harms our economy. Sure, but that means that we would lose some comfort. But then, by supporting them, other people lose way more than their comfort. Other people are tortured, are killed. So again, would reason say that my comfort is more important than the comfort of the people in Ukraine or the comfort of the Uyghurs or the Tibetans? No, reason doesn't say that. My sensuality does. So if you disagree with Kant here, then you are disagreeing as a sensual being. Your own animalistic self-interest disagrees. And whatever seemingly rational arguments you have is just sophistry and rationalization. It is just you employing your reason as an instrument. It is just you abusing your reason to serve you and excuse your sensuality. But what it comes down to is you not acting as a rational being, but as a sensual being. And that in itself is already evil. Again, you can go back to my lecture on the radical evil. The decision, my sensuality has precedence, I would rather follow my sensual drives, that decision already makes you evil. Everything that might come out of that decision, any big or small crimes, that's just a result of it. But it is that decision itself, to make that your principle, that your sensual desires come first, which is actually evil. And the radical evil to Kant is nothing else but the human propensity for taking up precisely that maxim and for lying to yourself about it, for telling yourself it's okay. And one such lie would be if now you say, well, everyone is like that. If you tell yourself, well, everyone is essentially a sensual being and everyone's reason is just an instrument of their animality, and so therefore everyone has this evil maxim. That's just an excuse. Even if it was true. And even if it was true, there was no way of proving it to be true. So it stays a mere claim that could never be proven. But let's say it's true. Then this would not at all prove that Kant's morality is wrong. It would just prove that we are all wrong, because no one is following Kant's morality. But that would just mean that we are all despicable and should all despise ourselves. It would not mean that we are excused. I mean, this would only make you think that you're excused if your standard for morality is not the actual moral law, but is other human beings around you. If you think, okay, I'm fine, I'm a good enough person, if you find yourself to be not much worse than everyone else around you, okay, then that's fine for you. But you should tell yourself, I'm a good person only if I conform to the moral law. Even if everyone else around me also doesn't conform to the moral law, that doesn't make it suddenly okay to not conform to it. I discussed this in my lecture about the ideal of holiness. So therefore, Kant very clearly says, if you act only as he would call it, a homo phenomenon, the appearing human being, the sensual human being, and not as a homo noumenon, the rational human being, humanity, the concept of humanity, the human being as he should be, then that already makes you evil. Kant says, I'm not allowed to protect my life if, through despicable actions, I make myself unworthy of it. Through this I abolish the good order of morality. A person defiles himself through this, and his action is not only reproachable, but at the same time despicable and disgraceful. And one of Kant's most favorite quotes is by Juvenal, who says, consider it the highest sin to throw away the true purpose of life for your mere life. Summum crede nefas, animam prefere pudori, et propter vitam vivendi perdere causas. And what many don't understand is that only to the evil person, only to the immoral person, will it be hard to do the right thing. If you are evil, again living in the Nazi times, and now a Jew wants your help to flee, okay, it might be hard for you to do the right thing because you would be risking your life. And people think that in order to do the right thing here, you would have to be incredibly brave. That's why they would consider it heroic, right? The hero is he who does more than could be expected normally. But you only need to be brave if your physical life matters more to you. Because being brave means that you are afraid, but you force yourself to act regardless. You overcome your fear. But the moral person does not need to be brave here, because the moral person will be more afraid for his own dignity and honor than for his life. That's the whole point. People have a hard time imagining that another posture than their own pathetic and immoral posture is possible, but it is possible. They might be willing, if it comes to that, to rather sacrifice their righteousness in order to keep their life, but the moral person would rather sacrifice his life in order to keep his righteousness. So, in a way, he's just as afraid as they are, but just for a different thing, right? Because he would not want to keep living if it means living with blood on his hands, if it means living as someone whom he has to despise, or with someone, right? As Socrates would say, I have to live with myself since I'm one. So if I became a murderer, I would have to live with a murderer for the rest of my life. Who would want that? So rather than keep your animal life, you would rather keep your rational life. Because that's what Kant says. If you get into a situation where it becomes impossible to keep living with your honor intact, where the only way to stay alive is if you sacrifice your honor, then your life already has ended. That is, your life as a rational being, your moral life. It's just your animal life which is still going on. And to keep your animal life in such a situation would mean committing moral suicide. And a moral person will not want that. So really, it comes down to what is more important to you. Being happy with the state you're in, feeling good, having welfare, lasting welfare, even happiness, or being happy with the person you are, being satisfied with yourself, with your own autonomy, with your own freedom, with you being someone who always does what he considers right, not what he is forced into or what his drives compel him to do. And of course, there have been people for whom their virtue mattered more and who even sacrificed their lives. But as I explained in my lecture on the ideal of holiness and in my lecture on why we need heroes and holy people in morality, such examples of people who acted morally are really just examples that prove that it is possible to act moral. They are not examples that prove the moral law as such, and if they didn't exist, that wouldn't disprove the moral law as such. That is very important. But what it comes down to is we are in danger either way. The question is only which danger matters more to you, which danger is greater to you. Kant says to get yourself in the danger of losing your life, that is certainly not prudent. But to get yourself into the danger of committing a vice, that is criminal and evil. And that is something you should not do. As Socrates said, it is better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice. And indeed, the good person will always try to do just that, to never commit an injustice, even if at the price of having to suffer an injustice. And Kant says, however, that the less worthy a person is of being alive, the more that person will usually cling to life. The people most worthy of life and of happiness are usually precisely those who care the least about it, who are the most ready to throw their lives away. Right? Think nowadays of someone like Greta Thunberg, who is willing to get into danger because she says that her life is not more important than that of the people in Gaza. So she's accepting the danger of being harmed. She's accepting being kidnapped and imprisoned and tortured. And obviously she is someone who is worth more than millions of other people. While many other who are worth absolutely nothing, and absolutely nothing would be lost to the world if they didn't exist, they cling so much to life that maybe they would even sacrifice others in order to stay alive. Or why would I say maybe even, when in fact most people are willing to sacrifice others not just to stay alive, but even just to have a comfortable life. And indeed, this statement of Kant's is one that in all times all the philosophers, all the wise people have agreed on, right? That the more worthy you are of life, the more great you are as a person, the less you will probably care about your life. I myself can say, if I reflect on myself, of all the people I know, I'm pretty much the one who is the least hating his life. It's not that I don't enjoy being alive. It's not that I feel the least bit depressed. It's not that I ever, even in my worst, my most terrible moments in life, considered suicide or anything. But still, without being suicidal in the slightest, if I did not have my mission, if I did not live to aufklär people, if I did not have several books to write still, several lectures to give still, several people I think I could help still, then I really would see no reason to stay alive. Again, not because I hate life, not because I'm suffering, not at all, but simply because it would not matter, right? And I find it absolutely absurd and ridiculous how many people who do nothing with their lives except existing and who would have to admit that neither reason nor the universe nor even most of their fellow human beings give one damn about them and could give one reason why it is good that they exist. It is absurd and ridiculous that still these people cling to their life so much and that they don't spend more or less all day laughing at themselves and laughing at how absurd they are. No, Kant says the more worthy of life you are, the less you will care about it, the more willing you would be to give up on it. And he also says you only have to consider, in order to understand how absurd it is to cling to your life anyways, you only have to consider that you cannot lose your life as a human being. You already lost it, or rather it was never yours, and what isn't yours also cannot be lost by you. Because we will all lose our lives sooner or later. We aren't immortal. So why would you be afraid of death? It's coming anyways. All we can lose, Kant says, is time, is some time of life. Okay, maybe you will die some years or some decades sooner. But in the grand scheme of things, what does that really matter? What difference does this make? So it's absurd to cling to life so much. And yet it's what most people do. And I keep having these discussions, like on the German channel in the comments, someone said under the lecture on moral or pragmatic politics, if we were attacked by a despotic regime, I would think it's good to defend our freedom, to defend our constitution. But I myself would run away. I would be too afraid to fight and risk my life. And I told him, that's absurd. You're self-contradicting, right? You can go to my lecture on the categorical imperative. That's what the categorical imperative is about. To not self-contradict, to not make an exception for yourself. If you have a rational insight that something is good, that something should happen, then you should act according to it. You cannot say, okay, I find it good that there's property. I want to have certain things that I own and that I can be sure of, that I can leave at home and they won't be stolen when I come back. So I want there to be property and I want there to not be theft. And then make an exception for yourself and then say, and yet still I will steal as if property didn't exist. That doesn't make sense. And likewise, you cannot say, I want my constitution, my freedom to be defended in case of an invasion. I consider them good. I consider it, I think that they ought to be preserved and defended. And yet I won't do it. That doesn't make sense. If you won't do it, you're saying they are not worth defending. if you say they are worth defending, then you say I should defend them. Both cannot be true at the same time. It's simply a self-contradiction. It's not even logical. And this guy said, yeah, but of course I'm afraid. It's only natural to be afraid. And the only possible reply to that, of course, would be, okay, maybe it's natural, but you're more than a natural being. You're not just an animal. So, goddamn, rise above your nature and be not a natural being, but a rational being. And to this kind of thing, Kant says, there's nothing which proves more strongly the incurable folly of the human race than that they cannot be deterred from their anxious worrying, from their stinginess in using present means, or from their avarice and greedy zeal by a reason so clear as that of the brevity of life. So, in conclusion, it is a commandment of reason, and one that no one can rationally disagree with, that in a case where what is prudent and what is moral is not the same, where I cannot choose both my happiness and my worthiness of happiness, and again, such cases are rare, rarer than most people think. They are the minority of cases, but they do exist, of course. It is absolutely true, and no one can rationally disagree, that in such a situation, I ought to sacrifice my happiness for doing what's right, for being virtuous. I'm not saying it's what you want to do. I'm not even necessarily saying it's what I or what Kant would want to do. No one is claiming that. I'm saying it's what you ought to do, rationally. And if you don't want to do it, then that is you precisely as an irrational, as a sensual individual who doesn't want to do that. But rationally, it's what you should do. Of course, the whole issue is that we live in a time of a-rationalism, so people don't even know what being rational means. They have twisted the meaning so much that they think seeking your own advantage is rational. But of course it's not. It's what every animal does. You don't need reason for that. The only reason they know is instrumental reason, where reason is a mere tool to reach your not rational goals. But it is Kant's great accomplishment to have shown that there's practical reason, where reason itself sets the goals. And as a rational being, you should follow your reason, not your animalistic desires. Still, with all of that said, it remains also true that the highest good should be realized. Yes, the one half is more important than the other. Yes, the other half should be sacrificed if need be. But as I said previously, a world where everyone is good but everyone is suffering, where everyone even chooses suffering, even sacrifices their happiness to do what is right, but then keeps suffering without deserving it, such a world would not be a world that should exist, would not be a world that even a neutral reason looking at it from the outside could approve of. Kant goes a bit too far sometimes, particularly in his lectures. Not so much his proper critical writings, but I keep saying that Kant sometimes is inconsistent and that Kant sometimes fails in his own opinions to quite go to the height of his own scientific philosophy. And so sometimes Kant says the moral law could not oblige us if it could not promise us happiness for the fulfillment of our duties. That is, of course, wrong. And it outright contradicts what Kant says in other cases, where precisely he says you ought to do the right thing because it's right, not because you get anything out of it. The reason Kant does make this wrong remark, I would say, is that here he confuses morality, as he often does, with the right. I talked about this more extensively in my lecture on the difference between ethics and right. Because in the area of right, there Kant keeps saying that a law can only oblige us if it can also protect us. And here this is of course correct, right? The state cannot impose laws on me without also bestowing me with rights. Like, you cannot tell the poor person who has absolutely nothing and is homeless and is starving not to steal food. If the state makes a law that no one is allowed to steal food, then the state also has to implement some sort of social security, at least, where poor people are guaranteed food. And likewise, you cannot take from people the right to live, but then at the same time demand that they don't kill. Of course, during the Nazi time, if a Jew had killed his guards to get away, how could you have blamed him, legally speaking? And likewise, today, there cannot be any legal blame. I emphasize legal blame. I'm not talking about moral blame. If Palestinians attack Israel, I mean, Israel is not giving them any rights. So why should they be expected to care for the rights of the Israelis? So in the area of right, it is perfectly correct because this is built on a social contract. And either you are part of the contract with rights and duties, or you are not. Then, just like an animal, you have no rights. Anyone can do to you whatever they want, but you also have no duties. You can also do whatever you want. And it's just back to who is stronger again. But Kant makes a mistake when, in some of his lectures, he applies this principle also to the moral law. Here, of course, as he himself would stress in the critique of practical reason, here, of course, this is not true. The moral law would still be valid even if we absolutely knew that following it would only make us suffer. But still, it should not be that it only makes us suffer. So what to do about this dialectic of practical reason, about this antinomy between the highest physical and the highest moral good, between happiness and deserving happiness? How do we connect those? Well, in my lecture on the project of the critique of reason and how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, I explained that according to Kant, all our judgments are either analytic or they are synthetic. In an analytic judgment, I'm not learning anything new. I'm just gaining clarity about what I already know, which is why Kant also calls them explaining judgments. That would be a judgment where I just analyze a concept I already have and try to find out what all is implied by that concept. So, for example, if I analyze what is a father and I realize, well, I'm always thinking of a male parent, right? If he's female, then it's a mother, and if it's not a parent at all, then, well, it's not a parent, neither father nor mother. The synthetic judgments, on the other hand, they synthesize two concepts that were not previously connected, and so I learn something new, which is why Kant also calls them expanding judgments, right? So if I learn through experience that ravens are black, well, I cannot analyze that. It's not part of the concept of a raven that it absolutely has to be black in order to be a raven. Nor is it part of blackness that it has to apply to ravens. Rather, in experience, I find these two connected. Well, Kant says the ancient philosophers tried an analytic solution, one or another, to the antinomy. they try to analyze the idea of the highest good and to find that in it both parts already are connected. But this doesn't work. So what we need, according to Kant, is a synthetic solution. The two parts are disconnected. They first need to be connected. But here the issue is that practical reason that we deal with in moral philosophy fails at this synthesis. The practical reason, the highest good is not real. It is ideal. It can serve us as an ideal. So in our moral actions, it can serve as something that we strive towards. And it can also serve as an ideal that we use to measure reality. That is, we can always compare reality with our idea of the highest good and see where reality still falls short, so where we still need to work on it, where we still need to increase happiness and or where we need to increase virtue, where we need to increase the worthiness of happiness. But practical reason cannot create an actual synthesis of both parts in this world. So, Kant says, the task is left to religion. Because in this world, happiness and people deserving happiness don't necessarily align. But maybe they do in the supersensual world. Maybe I have an immortal soul and my life will not end with my death. And maybe there is a just God that rewards the good deeds and that punishes the evil deeds. And if that was the case, then the highest derivative good, that is the good world, would be real. It would just not be the sensual world. It would be, once again, the supersensual world. Now, can we prove this? No. But there is a good reason to believe in it. Because otherwise our morality, that which the moral law commands us to do, would be absurd and pointless. So this is not a theoretical proof of the existence of God and the afterlife, but it gives us a practical reason why it is rational to believe in them. And this is precisely where Kant's moral philosophy ends and his philosophy of religion begins. Which is also, because this topic of the highest good is sort of the bridge between the two, why I wanted to talk about this last. Because next I want to get into his philosophy of religion. And there I will come back to this. And there what I now said in few words and what maybe doesn't make so much sense yet, will hopefully become more clear when I talk about Kant's moral theology and the moral proof for God. For now, I just want to close off by saying that Kant does not claim to be the first to have found this solution. Rather, he claims the first to have found this solution is Jesus. So, another ancient thinker, if you will. He says the ancient Greeks, before that, since they did not have Christendom, they could not form a synthetic solution to the antinomy. What they tried is to connect both parts of the highest good here in this world, in the sensual world, because it was the only world they knew. Jesus, Kant says, has taught more or less the same that Kant teaches, that here in this sensual world, both parts are disconnected. Even so much so that you can be the most holy person and you can end up dying a terrible death on the cross. But that they can be and will be connected in the other world. And only after Jesus had taught this could philosophy take up this truth and could understand it. So what Kant is claiming is not that he found something new, it is only that he understood it, that he lifted it from the level of a religious belief to something that has scientific clarity. And that I will explain further as I get into his philosophy of religion. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk Kubilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Kim Giamatti, Ellen Hansen, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.